The gleaming towers of Manhattan cast long shadows as Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart through the marble corridors of Blackstone Industries. At 53, she had been working the night shift for 8 years, invisible to the executives who ruled this corporate empire during daylight hours. Her weathered hands moved methodically across surfaces that cost more than she earned in a year. But Maria took pride in her work, no matter how others might view it. Tonight felt different. The usual emptiness of the 42nd floor was broken by light streaming from the corner office, the domain of CEO Jonathan Blackstone himself. Maria had only seen the billionaire in passing, a tall figure in expensive suits who moved through the building like he owned the world, which, in many ways, he did. She had never spoken to him, never even made eye contact. To him, she was part of the furniture, another piece of equipment that kept his world running smoothly. As she approached his office, Maria could hear the tension in his voice as he spoke on the phone. She had learned long ago to be silent during her work, especially when important people were conducting business. But something about the conversation made her pause, her instincts sharpened by decades of observing human nature from the shadows. Through the partially open door, she could see Jonathan pacing behind his massive mahogany desk, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. His jacket was draped over a chair, his tie loosened, and his dark hair fell across his forehead as he gripped the phone with white knuckles. The stress radiating from him was palpable, even to someone who cleaned around the edges of his world. Maria had seen powerful people at their most vulnerable moments before. The cleaning lady saw everything, the late-night breakdowns, the desperate phone calls, the human moments that never made it to the business pages. But this felt more serious than a bad quarterly report or a difficult merger. Maria continued her work quietly, emptying wastebaskets and dusting surfaces while Jonathan's conversation grew more heated. His voice carried undertones of desperation that made her uncomfortable, not because she was eavesdropping, but because she recognized the sound of someone being backed into a corner. She had heard those same desperate tones in her own neighborhood, when loan sharks came calling or when families faced eviction. The language might be different, wrapped in corporate jargon instead of street threats, but desperation sounded the same whether it came from a penthouse or a tenement. As she worked near his desk, gathering papers that had fallen to the floor, Maria couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. Words like hostile takeover, board vote, and final offer drifted through the air. She had worked in enough corporate offices to understand the basics. Someone was trying to take over Jonathan's company, and they weren't playing fair. What caught her attention more than the business details was the personal anguish in his voice. This wasn't just about money or power, this was about something deeper. As she dusted a nearby bookshelf, she heard him mention his father's legacy, his employees' livelihoods, and the promises he had made to communities dependent on his company's operations. Maria paused, her cloth stilling on the leather-bound volumes. She thought about her own children, about the promises she had made to give them better lives than she had known. She understood the weight of responsibility, even if her burdens were measured in hundreds of dollars rather than millions. When Jonathan finally ended the call, the silence in the office was deafening. Maria continued her work, moving with the practiced invisibility that had kept her employed for nearly a decade. But her mind was racing, pieces of overheard conversations fitting together like a puzzle she hadn't meant to solve. The next night, Maria arrived to find Jonathan still in his office, but this time, he wasn't alone. 3 men in expensive suits sat across from his desk, briefcases open, documents spread across the polished surface like weapons in a corporate battlefield. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and even from the hallway, Maria could sense the predatory nature of the meeting. She delayed her cleaning of that section, working instead in nearby offices while keeping an eye on the situation. Years of surviving in tough neighborhoods had taught her to recognize danger, and everything about this scene screamed warning. The men across from Jonathan had the cold confidence of people who believed they had already won, while Jonathan sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury. Through the glass walls that separated the executive offices, Maria watched as one of the men slid a thick document across the desk toward Jonathan. The billionaire's shoulders sagged as he read, his composure finally cracking. She had seen that look before, the expression of someone who had run out of options and was being forced to accept the unacceptable. The conversation was too muted to hear clearly, but body language told the story. The 3 visitors were calm, almost casual, while Jonathan's hands clenched and unclenched as he turned pages. Whatever was in that document, it was killing him to read it. One of the men checked his expensive watch and said something that made Jonathan's jaw tighten. Maria made her decision to clean the adjacent conference room, positioning herself where she could observe without being obvious. Her cleaning cart rattled slightly as she moved, but the men were too focused on their prey to notice the woman in the faded uniform who had become part of the building's furniture. As the minutes ticked by, she watched Jonathan's internal struggle play out in his posture and expression. This wasn't just a business decision. This was the moment that would define his legacy and the future of everyone who depended on his company. As Maria worked in the conference room, she noticed something the executives had missed. One of their briefcases hadn't closed properly, and papers had spilled onto the floor beneath the conference table. Instinctively, she moved to collect them, her trained eye catching details that made her blood run cold. The documents weren't just about buying Jonathan's company. They outlined a systematic plan to strip it for parts. Manufacturing plants would be closed within 6 months. Their operations moved overseas. The research division would be shuttered, its patents sold to competitors. Most shocking of all, nearly 80% of the workforce would be terminated within the first year. Maria had grown up in a factory town that died when the main employer pulled out. She had watched families destroyed, communities crumbling, dreams abandoned as economic opportunity vanished overnight. The clinical language of the corporate documents couldn't hide the human devastation they described. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the papers. In her neighborhood, she was known as someone who looked out for others, who warned families about predatory lenders and helped neighbors avoid scams. She had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was being taken advantage of, and every fiber of her being was screaming that Jonathan was walking into a trap. She thought about her own children, now adults with families of their own. Her son worked in one of Blackstone's regional offices, providing health insurance and stability for his young family. Her daughter had used a Blackstone scholarship to attend nursing school, part of the company's community investment program. Thousands of families like hers would be devastated if these men succeeded. As she finished collecting the papers, Maria made a choice that would change everything. She had spent her life invisible, silent, careful not to upset the balance that kept her employed. But some things were more important than job security, and she knew she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Moving with practiced stealth, she approached Jonathan's office where the men were now pressuring him to sign the documents immediately. Maria entered the office as quietly as possible, her cleaning supplies providing the perfect cover for her presence. The 3 men barely glanced at her. To them, she was just another piece of the building's maintenance, no more significant than the air conditioning system or the elevator machinery. Jonathan looked up briefly as she began emptying his wastebasket, and for a moment their eyes met. In that instant, she saw something that surprised her: recognition. Not of her as an individual, but recognition of her humanity. Unlike his visitors, Jonathan acknowledged her presence with a slight nod, a courtesy she hadn't expected from someone of his stature. The lead negotiator was explaining why Jonathan needed to sign immediately, his voice smooth and persuasive as he painted a picture of inevitable defeat. His company was hemorrhaging money, the board was losing confidence, and this offer was the only way to preserve anything of value. Every word was designed to increase pressure, to make Jonathan feel isolated and desperate. As Maria worked around the desk, organizing papers and refilling his water glass, she listened to the litany of threats disguised as business advice. The men spoke of leaked information that would tank the stock price, of board members who had already been compromised, of regulatory investigations that could be initiated if Jonathan didn't cooperate. When one of the men handed Jonathan a pen and pointed to the signature line, Maria knew she had reached the moment of decision. She could remain silent, invisible, safe in her role as an observer. Or she could step out of the shadows and risk everything to do what she believed was right. Moving closer under the pretense of cleaning the desk surface, Maria leaned down near Jonathan's ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the ambient noise of the city below. "Don't sign this," she breathed, so quietly that only he could hear. The effect of Maria's whispered warning was immediate and profound. Jonathan's hand, which had been moving toward the signature line, froze in midair. His eyes widened slightly as he processed what had just happened. The cleaning lady, invisible to everyone else in the room, had risked everything to warn him. The 3 men across from him were still talking, their voices a constant pressure designed to overwhelm his judgment and force a quick decision. But Maria's simple words had cut through their manipulation like a knife, reminding him that he wasn't as isolated as they wanted him to believe. Jonathan set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, buying time to think. The lead negotiator frowned at the sudden change in momentum, his practiced smile faltering for just a moment. They had been so close to victory, and now something had shifted in the room's dynamic. Maria continued her work as if nothing had happened, but her heart was pounding. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she knew that her life was about to change dramatically. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen, but she had committed herself to a course of action that would have consequences far beyond this midnight meeting. As she moved around the office, collecting trash and straightening papers, Maria caught Jonathan's eye again. This time, his look was different. Questioning, assessing, trying to understand why someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose had chosen to help him. The men were growing impatient, their polite facade beginning to crack as they realized their carefully orchestrated pressure campaign was losing momentum. The lead negotiator checked his watch again and made a comment about other opportunities that wouldn't wait, a not-so-subtle threat that this was their final offer. But something had fundamentally changed and the spell of inevitability they had woven was broken, and Jonathan was beginning to see the situation with clearer eyes. As the tension in the office escalated, Maria made another crucial decision. Moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who belonged in the space, she began tidying the conference table where the men had spread their documents. To them, she was performing routine maintenance, but she was actually studying their papers with the sharp intelligence that had helped her survive decades of economic hardship. What she saw confirmed her worst fears and more. Hidden among the standard acquisition documents were agreements that would give the buyers access to Blackstone's proprietary technology, customer lists, and manufacturing processes. This wasn't just a hostile takeover. It was corporate espionage on a massive scale, designed to benefit foreign competitors at the expense of American workers and innovation. Maria's mind raced as she connected the dots. Her late husband had been a factory worker who lost his job when similar tactics were used to gut his employer. She had seen entire communities destroyed by corporate raiders who promised to preserve jobs while secretly planning to eliminate them. The pattern was always the same: acquire, extract value, and abandon the wreckage. Her daughter's nursing education had been funded by Blackstone's scholarship program, which helped working-class families access higher education. Her son's job provided health insurance that covered his diabetic daughter's medical needs. Thousands of families like hers depended on the company's commitment to its workforce, a commitment these men were planning to betray. As she worked, Maria noticed other details that the executives had overlooked in their confidence. Phone numbers written on napkins, names of board members with notes about their vulnerabilities, references to regulatory officials who could be influenced. This wasn't just business. It was a conspiracy involving multiple parties working to orchestrate Blackstone's downfall. The lead negotiator was pressing harder now, his voice taking on an edge of threat as he spoke about consequences for delay. But Maria could see that Jonathan was no longer listening with the same desperate attention. Her warning had planted a seed of doubt that was growing by the minute. Jonathan suddenly stood up, his movement so abrupt that all conversation stopped. The three men looked at him expectantly, assuming he was ready to sign. But his expression had hardened into something they hadn't seen before. The look of a man who had found his strength. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a new authority. "I'm going to need more time to review these documents properly." The lead negotiator's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath his polished exterior. "Mr. Blackstone, we've been very clear about the time constraint. This offer expires at midnight tonight." "Then it expires," Jonathan replied firmly. Maria continued her work, but she could feel the shift in the room's energy. The predators had lost their prey, and they were beginning to realize that their carefully laid plans were unraveling. Their confident demeanor was replaced by barely controlled anger as they gathered their papers with sharp, aggressive movements. As the men prepared to leave, one of them turned back to Jonathan with undisguised hostility. The threats were no longer veiled in business language. They spoke of leaked information, regulatory investigations, and board challenges that would destroy him within weeks. But Jonathan had found his resolve. As Maria had suspected, he was not the weak, isolated figure they had believed him to be. With her simple warning, She had reminded him that he had allies, that he wasn't alone in this fight, and that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. After the men left, slamming the door behind them, the office fell into silence. Jonathan sat heavily in his chair, the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders. Maria continued cleaning, giving him time to process, but both of them knew that their lives had changed irrevocably in the span of a few whispered words. Finally, Jonathan looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time in 8 years of shared but separate existence in the same building. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer than Maria had ever heard it. "Maria Santos," she replied quietly, still unsure of what consequences her actions might bring. Jonathan studied her face, taking in the intelligence behind her tired eyes, the strength in her weathered features, the dignity she maintained despite wearing a cleaning uniform in a world of $1,000 suits. "How long have you worked here?" 8 years, Mr. Blackstone. "And in all that time, have you ever spoken to me before tonight?" Maria shook her head. "No, sir. I work nights. We don't usually cross paths." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. A woman he had never acknowledged, whose name he had never known, had risked her livelihood to save him from what could have been a catastrophic mistake. "Those men," he said slowly. "They were going to destroy everything my father built. Everything I've tried to preserve." Maria nodded. She had understood the stakes better than he had realized. "You could have lost your job for interfering," Jonathan continued. "Why did you risk it?" Maria thought carefully before answering. She could have mentioned her son's employment, her daughter's scholarship, the thousands of families who would suffer if the company was destroyed. But that wasn't the whole truth. "Because it was wrong," she said simply. "And sometimes you have to speak up when something's wrong, even if it's scary." The simplicity and honesty of her answer struck Jonathan more powerfully than any corporate mission statement or business school philosophy ever had. Here was someone who understood moral courage in its purest form. "Maria," he said, "I think you may have saved my company tonight. More than that, you may have saved thousands of jobs." She nodded, not with pride, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done what needed to be done. Block 10. The investigation. Over the next few days, Jonathan did something he had never done before. He began investigating his own company from the bottom up, starting with the observations and insights of people like Maria, who saw everything but were rarely heard. What he discovered shocked him. The cleaning staff, security guards, and maintenance workers had noticed patterns that his executive team had missed. Unusual meetings after hours, visitors who didn't sign in properly, executives who seemed nervous and secretive. The people who worked in the shadows had been watching a conspiracy unfold in plain sight. Maria became his guide to this hidden world, introducing him to employees who had information they had never been asked to share. The night security guard had noticed the same visitors coming and going at odd hours, always meeting with certain board members. The mail clerk had observed unusual packages and documents being sent to offshore addresses. The parking garage attendant had seen luxury cars with diplomatic plates making regular visits. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of the elaborate scheme that had been constructed around him. The hostile takeover was just the visible tip of an iceberg that included industrial espionage, board corruption, and international corporate warfare. Jonathan realized that he had been living in a bubble, surrounded by advisors and executives who either couldn't see the broader picture or were actively working against him. The people he had trusted most were the ones who had isolated him from the truth, while the people he had barely acknowledged were the ones who could have warned him if anyone had bothered to listen. With Maria's help, he began building a case that would expose the conspiracy and protect his company. But more importantly, he began to understand that his greatest assets weren't in his executive boardroom. They were in the break rooms, the security desks, and the cleaning supply closets where real people did honest work and saw the world clearly. The investigation revealed corruption that went far beyond a simple takeover attempt, involving foreign governments and corporate espionage on a scale that threatened national security. Block 11. Transformation. The revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the business world, but the changes within Blackstone Industries were even more profound. Jonathan had learned that his company's greatest strength lay not in its technology or market position, but in the loyalty and intelligence of people he had never bothered to know. Maria found herself in an unprecedented position. Jonathan had asked her to serve as a liaison between management and the workforce, a role that didn't exist in the corporate hierarchy, but filled a crucial gap in communication. Her insights into employee concerns, operational inefficiencies, and security vulnerabilities proved invaluable. The company established new channels for employee feedback, security protocols that included input from all levels of staff, and community investment programs that went far beyond traditional corporate philanthropy. Jonathan realized that his father's legacy wasn't just about profits and growth. It was about creating an organization that served all its stakeholders, not just its shareholders. Maria's son received a promotion to a management position, not because of nepotism, but because his mother's courage had revealed his own overlooked talents. Her daughter was offered a full scholarship to complete her master's degree in nursing, along with a guaranteed position in the company's new employee health and wellness program. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jonathan himself. He began making regular rounds through all areas of the company, talking to employees at every level, learning about their challenges and ideas. He discovered a wealth of innovation and dedication that had been invisible to him when he lived exclusively in executive suites and boardrooms. The media coverage focused on the conspiracy and the dramatic corporate intrigue, but those who lived through the transformation knew that the real story was about the power of human connection and the importance of listening to voices that are often ignored. Block 12. Justice and Redemption. The federal investigation that followed exposed a network of corporate espionage and corruption that reached into multiple industries and government agencies. Several board members were arrested, foreign agents were expelled from the country, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar schemes in the future. Jonathan testified before Congress about the importance of protecting American businesses from sophisticated foreign interference. But he spent equal time talking about the need for corporate leaders to stay connected to their workforce and communities. Maria became something of a celebrity, featured on news programs and business magazines as the woman who saved a Fortune 500 company. But she remained grounded in her values, using her platform to advocate for working families and the importance of treating all employees with dignity and respect. The attempted takeover collapsed completely when the conspiracy was exposed, and several of Jonathan's supposed advisors were revealed to be working for the would-be acquirers. New board members were elected, including several employee representatives, an unprecedented move that made Blackstone Industries a model for corporate governance reform. The company not only survived but thrived, with employee satisfaction and productivity reaching record levels. The programs initiated by Maria's insights became templates for other organizations seeking to build more inclusive and secure corporate cultures. Jonathan established a foundation in Maria's honor, focusing on educational opportunities for working families and whistleblower protection for employees who speak truth to power. But he knew that the foundation was just a symbol. The real change was in how the company operated every day. 5 years later, Maria still worked at Blackstone Industries, but now she split her time between her facilities management role and her position as Director of Employee Relations, a job title that had been created specifically for her unique talents and perspective. Block 13. Legacy of Courage. The story of Maria Santos and Jonathan Blackstone became a case study in business schools around the world, but not for the reasons either of them expected. It wasn't just about corporate espionage or hostile takeovers. It was about the power of moral courage and the importance of listening to voices that others might ignore. Maria never regretted her decision to speak up that night, even though she couldn't have imagined where it would lead. She had acted from instinct and conscience, the same values that had guided her through decades of struggle and survival. The fact that her simple words had prevented a catastrophe affecting thousands of people was both humbling and empowering. Jonathan often reflected on how close he had come to disaster, not because of market forces or business cycles, but because he had isolated himself from the very people who could have warned him. The lesson he learned was that true leadership meant staying connected to everyone who had a stake in the organization's success. The transformation of Blackstone Industries inspired other companies to examine their own communication channels and security procedures. The Maria Protocol became shorthand for creating systems that allowed information and concerns to flow freely between all levels of an organization. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the individuals whose lives intersected in that midnight meeting. Jonathan had learned to see the humanity in every employee, while Maria had discovered that her voice could carry more power than she had ever imagined. Years later, when Jonathan was asked about the most important business decision he ever made, He would smile and talk about the night he chose to listen to a whispered warning from someone he had never really seen before. It was a reminder that wisdom and courage can come from the most unexpected sources, and that the most valuable insights often come from those who see the world from the margins. The cleaning lady who saved a billionaire CEO became more than just an inspiring story. It became a testament to the idea that everyone has something valuable to contribute, if only someone is willing to listen. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of courage, wisdom, and the power of unexpected alliances. Maria's simple act of bravery reminds us that heroism can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the most important voices are the ones we're not used to hearing. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from around the world, and share your thoughts about Maria's courageous decision to speak up when it mattered most. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people who change the world through extraordinary acts of courage and compassion.